A wise man once said, wherever we go, that is where we are. And I know that sounds pretty simplistic, but it also implies that when we get there, we're alone. But that is not the case. You see, wherever we go in the galaxy, something else is with us. Some things that are magic, things from which we cannot escape. We are saturated with them. We can go to the top of Mount Everest. We can go to the lowest depths of the ocean. We can scale the Great Wall of China. We can even ride the Channel train under the English Channel. We can visit the moon, and they are there too. We are technically never alone. They pierce our bodies. They are in every cell. Most of the time, though, we are unaware of that invasion unless we seek them out. At this very moment, the room is full of them, ceiling to floor, wall to wall. But even before man understood what that invasion was, even before he made his first early halting attempts to understand them, to make friends with them, they were here. From the first eruption of a volcano to the flash of lightning in the sky, when a lion runs through dry grass, these things sparked and flew and lit. They swirled. They fascinated early man with an aurora of light. From the first days of man, they were there, wild, random, powerful, unstoppable. Man has been surrounded by them all of his life. But he would go millions of years conscious of them, but not thinking much about them. Their presence, though, began to interest scientists, and learned men began to ask questions. Finally, in 1894, a young, charismatic Italian inventor, Guglielmo Marconi, found a better way to study them. He harnessed the fire in the sky, and his inventions would spark a revolution. But before we go back to Marconi's workshop, let's go forward to today. Tune in any AM radio and then put it near a motor or a fluorescent bulb, or hold it in a thunderstorm. The radio speaker will crackle and scream with a flood of interference. You see, Mother Nature is full of unlicensed radio transmitters, and we call all of that static. But to Marconi, static was music to his ears. He wondered if it would be possible to find a way to copy Mother Nature's static and make his own, to make tiny, intense bolts of lightning that would burn their way through the air, ionizing it as they went. How could he make a machine to make sparks? Well, he created a gap, allowed electricity to jump across it, and made mini lightning. It worked fine, but how could he prove it was working? He created his sparking machine to produce a short burst, and then another one, and then a long burst, and random bursts that could be picked up. And finally, he did make what we would now call a receiver. And he was amazed that he could differentiate his static from the random static in the air, because he was sending it out in a pattern. He would send a short burst and then a long one, a short one and then a long one, and then he realized he was sending out the letter A in Morse code. He took his invention to England, and he tried it out on Salisbury Plain in the shadow of Stonehenge. First, he could hear his special static a mile away, then 2 miles, then finally 8 miles, and to a point across the horizon. He had done what no man had ever done before, not with tom-toms or jungle drums, not ship to ship with flags and semaphores or puffs of smoke from native people's fires, and not down wires strung pole to pole by early telegraph companies. Marconi had harnessed the fire in the sky, electromagnetic waves, radio waves, and he had taught them to talk through the very air that had crackled with static. He had cut the umbilical cord of communications. He had harnessed the fire in the sky, and wireless was born. For more than 2 decades, though, wireless was simply point-to-point communications. Marconi had become an international celebrity. He set up a large company in the U.S. to outfit ships and shore stations. They used it to facilitate the movement of cargo and to improve their safety. Through all of this, he became powerful and wealthy. He was a man with a vision of taking thoughts and ideas and warnings and timetables, messages and information, converting them to Morse code, dots and dashes, and sending them from point A to point B via wireless. But his vision was limited. Others would take up that idea and build on it. One of those visionaries was a Canadian inventor named Reginald Fessenden. It was a cold Christmas Eve in 1906. The weather was blustery off the coast of New England. Hundreds of radio operators on ships were winding down the day's work. Except for some special notices, there is not much ship-to-shore traffic on Christmas Eve. Some of the sailors stranded on ships anchored off the States and the Canadian maritime provinces had asked their radio operators to send "sorry I can't be with you tonight" messages, but that was just about it. The temperature began to drop, and snow began to fall. As midnight neared, many radio men took off their headphones and headed for hot coffee and donuts. On bigger ships, they went to church. It would be those few radio operators who stayed at their posts who would become a party to one of the most important moments in the history of communications. Something beyond their wildest expectations was about to happen. Suddenly the sound of the static changed. What emerged from their headphones was not the familiar dots and dashes of Morse code, but something else, something no one had ever heard before through a radio. It was Silent Night, played on a violin by Reginald Fessenden in a radio shack on the New England coast. And after the music died, they heard him say something else. He was speaking. Reginald Fessenden said, "Merry Christmas." Were these operators dreaming? Was the spirit of Christmas getting the best of them? Wireless, you see, was not supposed to be like that. It's dots and dashes, cut and dried, point to point. But Fessenden sent out a message to anyone. He found a way to pierce the static in the air with recognizable human sounds. It was a Christmas gift the world would treasure forever. Sadly, a man who was working at the same time as Fessenden would get most of the glory. A strange little man named Lee DeForest would claim that he was the father of radio. And despite the fact that Fessenden technically beat him to the punch, in many ways, DeForest was correct. His method of putting the human voice on the air was like Fessenden's, only it was slicker. He developed a radio tube he called the Audion. Without the ability to change the texture of a signal, the transmission of the human voice was really not possible. In a studio in New York City, he had local singers perform. He shared with Fessenden the idea that radio was more than point-to-point communications, that it could be used in DeForest words to bring music into everyone's home. Along the way, the growing world of radio would be populated with a long list of characters, most of them working in the background, unknown to the general public. Foremost among them was Edwin Howard Armstrong. Now, as a boy, he was fascinated by radio from the beginning. But listening at night in his Yonkers, New York bedroom to radio sets that he made himself, he had the same problem that DeForest and Marconi had had since day one. It was difficult to pick up weak radio stations. There had to be a better way, and the teenage Armstrong found it. One night at 2 a.m, he suddenly found that faraway Marconi stations to which he had been listening not only came in louder on his headphones, but louder to a magnitude of 1,000 times. He simply picked up a weak signal and injected it back on itself. He did it again and again, almost to the point of causing howling feedback, but not quite. His feedback, or heterodyne circuit, would revolutionize radio, making reception of weak signals possible. Later, after being made a major by the Army for his work in World War I, increasing the range of airborne radios for the Army Signal Corps, he would take his old feedback circuit and make it more sophisticated. He came up with the super heterodyne circuit. He sold the idea to RCA. That company and its young president, David Sarnoff, would use Armstrong's super heterodyne and his other inventions to drive RCA to the pinnacle of the radio business. And something else we forget about this gifted man. For years, he looked for a way to produce a cleaner AM sound, to somehow come up with a way to filter out the static, the fire in the sky that started all of this. Then one night, he said he had a dream. He thought of a way to make an entirely new means of radio transmission. He called it frequency modulation. The world would call it FM. But Armstrong's old friends at RCA didn't want to invest in it because they were working on something else. So they went on to perfect television. Armstrong developed FM alone, and some smaller companies eventually helped.